Good evening. I'm Michael Reddy. This is a Family Energetics free evening, and we think it's number 8. We're glad to have you here, or if you're watching on the video, we're glad to have you watching the video. I'm going to go back to a topic tonight and see if we can get into some discussion about it that I brought up originally in the US and Canadian Constellation Conversations, which I hosted around a year ago. And that topic is distinguishing process from perspective in constellation work. And that's something that I think is getting more and more important for reasons which I will start to explain. So I'm going to just review a bit just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So everybody, I think, probably here knows what trauma is. I wrote a blog recently on the NASCON website that said, 5 facts about trauma. There's really 5 stages. It's not just fight or flight, and it's not just fight or flight or freeze. It's really friends, fight or flight, freeze, and forget. All 5 of those come into play. First thing our nervous system does when it starts to get overwhelmed and scared is it looks for friends. Next thing it does, if it doesn't find friends, or even sometimes if it does, is it energizes everything and shuts down digestion, shuts down a lot of positive processes, and everything goes to whatever the body needs to restore safety. So everything is, adrenaline, lightning fast, very connected, very aware, hypervigilant. If that doesn't work, the nervous system does a complete about face and shuts down totally. It goes into freeze mode, which is like what animals do when they, quote, play possum, and they're not just playing, and we're not just playing. When your body goes into freeze mode, exactly the opposite happens from what happens when you are in fight or flight. Your blood is all pulled in from your muscles towards the center so that in case you get wounded, you won't bleed too much. Endorphins flood out. Your brain, in fight or flight and in freeze, your brain really changes. The blood flow changes. The limbic system, which is a more primitive part of the brain, takes over. It shuts down the parts that keep the left and right hemispheres talking to one another. It shuts down part of the forebrain. So you really are not processing what is happening to you in the same way at all. And then the 5th part of this is called forget. Because typically after you've been in some sort of threatening overwhelm, you have to get on with life, either quickly or over a period of weeks or whatever it is, depending on the kind of overwhelm and trauma that it is. But you basically have a lot of unprocessed memories. You have various parts of your body and nervous system and endocrine system that have shut down and not necessarily started up again the same way. There are these disconnections in a serious enough trauma. And that's called forget. I call that forget because it's, these feelings of overwhelm, it's like we can't function with them. And so we basically repress them, we pack them away, and there's, if you've had a badly damaged shoulder, for example, I'm tapping the shoulder that I separated twice in judo with a big lump on it. And you spend a long time in pain with that, then it's quite possible that that whole part of your body was, ostracized in a sense, excluded, honestly, in the constellation sense of exclusion. It doesn't necessarily get the same nutrients. It doesn't necessarily have the same nervous connections. And so later in life, it can often become a problem area, though this has not become a problem area for me. So that's trauma. The word trauma also means the state that persists after the overwhelm. In my book, I distinguished origin trauma from after trauma because the words are ambiguous. Origin trauma is whatever happened. Either it's an overwhelming event or it's a pattern of repeating less overwhelming events, but all had the same pattern. After trauma is the leftover disconnections in your brain, your body, your emotions, and sometimes your spiritual self as well. Now, what Hellinger did, learning from all of these different people that he gathered and synthesized from, was start to wake the world up to the fact that your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, and all of you know this is just a review, I know, that they could experience things, experience overwhelms, not process them in the course of their life, all right? And because they did not ever process them, they reside in this larger collective family soul, and they show up somewhere downstream in a descendant. So heritable ancestral trauma the two kinds of trauma are very similar in a way, because personal trauma that you actually personally experienced, that tends to show up somehow later in your life for healing. And if it doesn't show up, it's because you've built walls around certain areas of experience that tend to trigger those feelings of overwhelm, and you just don't go near them. So I think we all know people who've just sort of decided, I'm not going to process that. I'm not going to work with that. And that's, in some sense, that means that their soul is not going to evolve through this in this lifetime. And other people keep, by choice or without being able to choose, it comes back up. Ancestral trauma is interesting because it comes back up later in the lifetime of the collective family. Does that make sense? They're similar, but they're like fractals. They behave, the larger one, there's a larger collective life of the family soul, and that trauma just sits in, it shows up, 2 generations later in a son, a daughter, a grandson, whatever. So we're all pretty good with that here, I think, right? And remember, Michael loves questions and comments, so feel free to jump in. And I am going someplace with this. So here we have the prototype constellations that many of us learned early on, and that became very popular in Germany and then spread around the world. And the prototype constellations are basically workshop constellations. So there's a circle of people, there's a facilitator, there's a client, and the client is not in the constellation, right? And representatives are chosen intuitively and placed. So there's some kind of spatial configuration, a configuration in space of people who represent dad, the goal, the trauma, the whatever, right? That's kind of the prototype constellation. But very quickly, this has evolved. I mean, quickly, over I guess, probably about 3 decades. It's very clear for many of us that it's like hard to organize workshops where I live. Dan Booth Cohen started teaching me very early on to do private constellations. So a private constellation starts to diverge from that prototype workshop situation, because now we're picking either markers, or we're drawing on paper, or in my case, I have a whole floor area, and we're laying out my little object. I'm a shaman, so I talk about object persons. They're not dead to me. I have shelves and shelves of things. It's like a sand tray in a way. We're setting out not people now, but we're setting out object persons, like objects. There is a configuration. There's still a setup, right? There's still some geometry here. And the client and I take turns visiting and feeling into this, and out of that, we build the meaning of the constellation. We form the field and we build the meaning of the constellation. So that's different in that now, instead of having the the people in the workshop, people in the circle doing the representing, and the facilitator and the client mostly not doing that, mostly apart from that, watching it, all right, and we don't put the client in till the end. Now the client and I, or the facilitator, are involved from the very start. Then we got people doing, well, okay, so it looks like I can do this with mental imagery. Oh goodness, it looks like I can tell somebody, okay, so imagine yourself in a space, and imagine a clock around you, and you're at the very center of the clock, and in front of you is 12 o'clock, and behind you is 6 o'clock, and over to your right is 3, and over there's 9. And so let's bring your father in. Okay, where's your father? Okay, my father is towards 11 o'clock, not too far away. Is he facing you? Well, no, he's sort of sideways. It looks like he's looking down towards 7:30 or something like this. You follow what I'm doing, right? So now notice that here we've taken another departure, right? We've gone from actual people standing in a configuration in a room to objects in a configuration in a room with the facilitator and the client feeling into them alternatively and comparing notes. And now we've got just this happens a lot in voice-only constellations. I mean, Dan ended up doing most of his, in the beginning, when he was working with me, a lot of it was like, the constellation was in his head and in my head. And he would ask me, where is your dad? And I'd say, my dad is over towards 11 o'clock. He's kind of, halfway out towards the edge of the clock, and he's looking at 7:30 and so on. And this gets very much like NLP stuff, like neuro-linguistic programming imagery. So we've got another bit of a departure here, right, from the prototype constellation form. Then we've got, coming from the other direction, we got shamans and people like this, indigenous people who've done ancestral work for a long time. And their work is ancestral because they're trying to work with an ancestor, and they're trying to work with an inherited trauma, but they're not setting up a group of people anymore. They're just like one client and one ancestor. You follow me? What's her name? I can't think of her name. Who organized the second conference? Linda, do you remember?
Francesca? No.
No, I'm sorry. It's being old. That's what makes me not able to remember him. On the Constellation call years ago, we had her on, and she had a whole way of doing this too, which did not involve a configuration anymore, right? So what we've done is we've gone from people are the configuration to objects are the configuration to, well, we just have an image of the configuration on our heads. And then coming in from the other direction, we got people on the outside that have been doing this for ages, indigenous people, and they're really kind of more dealing with just one ancestor and one client at a time, and it's mental imagery, or they're doing it by themselves or whatever. But you notice that we're departing more and more from the prototype constellation. So this is what I mean by process. All right. The perspective of constellation work is we know about ancestral trauma. We understand that trauma is inheritable. Okay, if it doesn't get processed when it happens, it resides in the family. We knew about that stuff. We knew about that stuff long before other people knew about it and accepted it. Okay? So our perspective hasn't really changed. Our perspective has enlarged. We know more about it now, right? We've learned more of the patterns, and we're all getting better, and there's more and more books about it and stuff like this. But it hasn't changed. The perspective hasn't changed in some fundamental way. It's just enlarged. Now, we get around to Right now, if you look at Dan Booth Cohen is doing what he calls seeing with your heart. And that's kind of, to my understanding, it's still ancestral work, but there's not any setup at all. And so from the, if we think of constellation in terms of perspective, yes, it's still a constellation. If we think of it in terms of process, it's not really a constellation at all anymore. Now, what sense am I making, folks? Somebody talk to me here. Sharon, are you there? You're muted and we don't see you. Oh, we couldn't see her before, could we, Marie?
Yeah.
You're muted. You're gonna have to
So
unmute.
can I ask, can you reword your question to us?
The question was like, what do you think?
Oh, okay. I didn't get that.
Like, how are we doing so far? What sense is this making? What comments, thoughts do you have? Like, let's talk amongst ourselves.
Okay, what I'm understanding is that initially you could identify the constellation perspective based on what you saw or understood as process. Yeah. And so now it's arrived where it's just simply the intent or the perspective, and you may not necessarily recognize that intent by what is happening.
Yeah.
Unless you knew.
That makes good sense. Well, and then there's the question of what do we mean by constellation, right? The other reason that it's really important to talk about this is that in the meantime, epigenetics has come along, and epigenetics, so let me give you a little discourse here quick on genetics. The big deal in genetics 30, 40 years ago was, okay, we've figured out that, well, it goes all the way back to Darwin, that there's no way to inherit any kind of experiences that if your mother's athletic, that doesn't mean you're going to have big muscles. Your mother has trauma, that has nothing to do with you. Because the only thing that made you was these DNA molecules in your genes, and they were a strict one-way, top-down determination of what you became. So genetics is destiny, right? That was the belief. And they did this whole thing, the Human Genome Project, and they, spent millions of dollars in many years, and they figured out the whole human genome. And there were just a huge number of surprises in this. It turned out that our DNA, which they thought would have 100,000 genes, it only had 24, and most of those were the same as a chimpanzee. And there wasn't that much difference in the DNA of a fruit fly and us. And they were just like, and a lot of it was called junk DNA. We don't know what it's doing even there, right? And various experiments that had happened in the past that just got shoved under the rug because they didn't fit. There was the big deal, the big study was the thing in Oberkallik in Norway or Sweden, this village where they had a whole bunch of, they kept the parish kept records, amazing records. And they had famines. So people were able to go and study, like, okay, what happened to what was the lifespan? They had 100, I think it was 100 men. And they were able to study, okay, we know that your grandmother was in a famine when you were in the womb, or we know that such and such was happening when you were 2 years old. And they ended up with these astonishing results that people who had been in the womb, I may not be getting this exactly right, but there were, people whose grandparents had gone through certain experiences had an average lifespan of 32 years less than other people. And this was like totally mind-boggling. This blew the roof off of, because this was a solid study and it just opened all these doors. And since then, epigenetics is like the big thing. What's going on? What's going on is that the genes, that, you know, these little instructions for assembling proteins, you know, the master code and everything, it's not a one-way dance at all. Around the gene are all these switches, this whole vast computer system of switches that is responsive to the environment and turns these genes on and off. It upregulates or downregulates them. So you can have some very terrible gene, but you may never have turned it on. Or you can have some really good genes and you never turned those on. And the big deal turns out to be that, oh, these switches, this whole system of switches, oh goodness, that can be inherited. So the DNA doesn't change. You got your mom and your dad's pairing, and that's that. But what your mom and dad were doing with it, how they were switching it on and off, oh, you can get that. You can get serious chunks of that. So now at this point, this has been, you know, they studied kids who were in the womb during the 9/11 attacks, and they're way more susceptible to PTSD. They've studied mice that, you know, there were mouse moms that had very good mothering, nurturing styles, and ones that had very bad, non-nurturing styles. And the female children of those for many, many generations inherit the same styles. There's just, if you look in PubMed, which is like one of the big registries of all the abstracts of all the stuff that gets published in research and everything, and you look up epigenetics, there's a huge, huge amount of research on this. So what I'm saying is now the world outside of our constellation community is coming around to the understanding of heritable ancestral trauma in a very big way, independent of us. Somebody told me, I think it was, I don't remember who, and she sent me a link, but I haven't looked. There was a whole conference on inherited ancestral trauma at Stanford. It didn't have anybody from the constellation world in it. So what I'm trying to say here is it's becoming more important for us to distinguish process from perspective, because the perspective is growing independently of us, and it's giving rise to all sorts of different processes for working with it. My own experience of going to the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology, and this will be my 5th year this year, and talking about constellations and energy psychology as a kind of integrated toolkit, which that's really become my toolkit now. I've watched people come and listen to me, and then a year or two later they come back and they're doing ancestral trauma, but they're not doing constellations. All right. I saw one whole session in which a woman was working with a client, and she had the client in a kind of 2-chair situation, and the client would go over and be the grandmother and then come back and be the herself, and was working with, the grandmother's stuff, right? Was trying to help this client give grandmother back her fate. What sense are we making? We good?
We're good.
Sharon, how are you doing? I don't know whether this stuff is a little newer to you.
This is very new, but I'm following so far.
All right, well, you please jump in, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, no, please feel free, because this is basic stuff, and I think it's very important, and there's no reason why we can't make sure that you come along with the discussion. Okay?
Thank you.
And I saw another lady do a kind of thing where she said, all right, well, behind you stretches the last 5 generations. And you're now going to walk backwards, and you're moving backwards through 5 generations. And now, as you walk forward, you will be resolving all the ancestral trauma. With each step, you are resolving more ancestral trauma. And she atoned this with great majesty and power, and that was her ancestral healing. Now, you know, a lot of healing depends on the belief system of the healer and how that belief system impacts the belief system of the healee, the person being healed, right? It's odd because the word shaman, you know, for us it's related to sham, i.e. fraud, even though that's not its origin etymologically. It comes from somewhere Ukraine or Russian or something like this. But the fact is, if you put on a good enough performance and affect somebody's belief system and you get them to believe, you start to have a placebo effect on them. Does that make sense? Is that term familiar to everybody?
Yes.
Placebo effect is, you know, where they give people a sugar cube or something and it turns out to have the same effect as the medicine because the people don't know that they didn't get the medicine. And there's some really astonishing stuff that's gone on around that. And there's a lot of tests of drugs that the FDA approves where the efficacy of the drug is only 5 or 10% better than placebo. All right. And so go ahead, Linda.
No, I'm agreeing.
Yeah, no, that was I'm sorry. I should say Linda H.
It sounded to me as if you were saying, and maybe you were, that when that woman had the imagination of 5 generations behind her and had the person walk through, that was a placebo rather than something else, that was not a valid process. Is that what you meant?
What I mean is, if that worked, which I'm skeptical of, which for reasons I'll explain in a minute, but if that had an effect, it was because the lady who was delivering the healing was so sure of herself and did the magic incantations the way that she did, which she's been doing it for years, and she's got a whole system and she's quite good at it, you know.
So you're going to distinguish here between her perspective or her intention and a process that you consider to have any sort of validity or not around that perspective.
That's what I'm leading towards here is
right. Great.
That we need to distinguish the perspective, because a lot of people are adopting the perspective. And so we have to start thinking about, we have to start thinking about 2 things. If somebody comes to a Constellation conference and they're doing the perspective, but they don't have anything like the process, what do we think of that? Is that still a constellation? Do you understand me? I mean, I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that it's a question.
Mm-hmm.
That process that you just mentioned of that woman reminds me very much of the process that's called the script. Who's the lady who wrote that? I can see the book, Healing the Heart or something. I can just see the book cover. But her script is along that lines of, let's take ourselves right back to the beginning and move through and unfold everything that wasn't right all the way through up to the present time. And says it, as she said, it's effective if it's done very meditatively.
I question.
But that's what reminds me, it could almost be a blend of those 2 things. Yeah.
Some people are going to have good effects from processes. How deep they go, how powerful they are, how much they can really resolve, that's another question. What I'm going to say to you in a few minutes is, I think the Constellation process, the actual setup, is a whole systems approach, okay, which is likely to go deeper and work better than one-on-one ancestor-client healings. All right. I'm not saying that the one-on-ones don't have any effect. I'm sure, you know, who am I to say that? I don't know that. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that there are situations where there's not some other entanglements that grandmother has, and that, you know, we could work with grandmother one-on-one, and that might do, you know, might be fine. We might give grandmother's fate back and we're good. But if giving grandmother's fate back is entangled with grandmother acknowledging that she really screwed up her daughter and is now close to her granddaughter, and part of that is still damaging her daughter, or her husband is involved. If there's other entanglements here, that one-on-one process is not going to pick those up.
That's one of the things, excuse me, that I wanted to ask. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the constellations that you do actually address situations and find out where these situations came from, not just, you know, like the one you said where she just walked backward and then walked forward. That didn't really address any individual problem.
I agree. You got it right. I'll qualify it a little bit, Sharon. We don't sometimes know the facts of the situation, but we know that, you know, when I see certain sort of trauma in a client, I know that you know, I know that behind them is stuff of a certain kind. I don't know the exact shape of it, and I don't have to really. You understand me? Mm-hmm. And I don't try to, but I know that there's something metaphorically resembling what's going on with the client that happened back there someplace, somehow. I think I mentioned this example last week, but I have a client now whose mother, the grandmother fled Ukraine, then went to Germany, then was deported to South America, and lived in the jungle. And her daughter and the grandmother was terrified of the secret police, was just terrified to the end of her days. She'd get rigid when a police car drove by. Okay, which also tells us that she kind of didn't really ever deal with this, if it was still affecting her that much at age 60, 70, whatever. So then her daughter, which is now the mother of the client, is left out in, you know, laying loose on some picnic or something, and this pack of jungle ants come and start eating her eyeball, and she's like a 3-month-old baby. Now, do you see the analogy to the secret police? The baby is helpless. The baby is being attacked by some organized group of entities that function together and that are doing destructive things. Do you follow me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so that's what I mean by a metaphorical resemblance. But so I'm just qualifying what you're saying a little bit, because we don't always know that. Sometimes we do know the facts. Sometimes what happens in the constellation we find out later is indeed the facts. Somebody comes along and says, yeah, that really happened. Okay? But where I'm going with this is that the outside world, psychologists, all these people studying epigenetics and looking at, you know, the world is getting this idea that the traumas that you carry, maybe you didn't experience all of them. That some of them it didn't happen to you. You're carrying the fate. You have a displacement of fate, as it's called. You have a hidden loyalty. You are bonded somehow to an ancestor, and you are trying to, out of love, what Hellinger called blind love, you are carrying the pain of that person for them. All right? The world is figuring that out. And it's coming at it from various different perspectives. Excuse me. It's coming at it with various different processes. So and again, my whole point is we need to start talking about the difference between our process and our perspective, because the perspective is showing up all over the world A lot of different processes are being brought to bear on this, and we now start to have to compare our process to some other people's process. Frankly, I think ours, in many cases, is better. I go to these meetings and say that, basically, because it's whole systems. And I don't care if you're just working with a live client in the midst of a family situation right now. Family systems theory basically says you cannot sometimes help that client who's stuck in a system that system needs that client to have that trauma. And if you can't help the client get out of that system or shift it somehow, you have a very hard time healing them because they're enmeshed, they're entangled. Okay, so now, comments, thoughts, questions? Michael loves questions. Yes, please.
As you opened up the topic, which is fascinating, I wondered if you have seen any, I have read somewhere, and one of the Constellation books I've read, which are about 40, that there's sort of placement of children that, for example, the firstborn inherits the father's trauma, the secondborn inherits the mother's. Can you speak to that a little bit, or what do you
Yeah,
of that theory?
I've neither read nor experienced it that specifically. What I read, and which seems to be true in my own experience, is that the older children the first and second born tend to be more involved with the immediate, parents, and that as you go further down in the sibling line, they tend to go back further. But it's just a tendency. It's not some kind of hard, fast rule.
No, I use it just as a place to start investigation.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you. I love questions. Michael loves questions. So what do you think? Hello, Izzy. No, she's not talking yet. How are you doing, Sharon? We making sense?
So far, yes. I'm trying to process it in my head, but I am following along. I may have questions for you later.
Okay.
I just don't want to throw you off of what you're going with the many questions.
Really,
either.
the idea here is not that I have something that I absolutely want to cover. I want to say enough to engender discussion, and then we'll go wherever it goes.
Okay.
Linda H., go ahead, please.
So what I'm understanding, as I think the point you're wanting to make, is that with something like imagining the 5 generations and moving through may engender some feeling of something within the person who's doing it, but there's nothing that's really brought up into consciousness that's specific and unhealed from the past. And when that person or event has a voice, you've got a whole different dynamic that then is very freeing and could only be more resolving because of that voice is finally expressed and some healing can happen. And that's the power of real constellation work.
Yes. Indeed. Excellently said. I would also take it a step further and add that when at times it needs more than one voice from the past. So even in the case where I saw Barbara Stone working with one ancestor and doing the 2-chair thing, and I thought that was kind of good in a way. But in the back of my mind is, yeah, but is grandmother going to, can the client really give it back? I would so much rather see whoever else is relevant here on the floor and see what they do when we try to make this happen, right? Do you follow me? That's what I mean by the whole systems approach. Now, obviously, we got 2 hours or whatever for a constellation before people's attention flags and things like this. So we take some we take a view. We don't ever get the whole thing, right? We grab some pieces of it that somehow seem to fit together and work with them. And frankly, I do, with difficult cases, I do successive constellations along with other, energy psychology and two-chair work. I do various things. I tend to get, once we say that there's trauma that didn't happen to you that you're carrying, and then trauma that can actually happen to you, we have to consider also that the trauma that did not happen to you that you're carrying can sometimes spark trauma that does happen to you. All right? And I get people I grew up like that, frankly. I grew up not only with my father's World War II mess, which I didn't find out until I was in my 60s, but I grew up with all the damage that he inflicted on us while he was a poor war veteran with no help and becoming an alcoholic, So I will do very often, and I don't try to do too much. A lot of my stuff is not workshop stuff because it's just Philadelphia just has not been a great place to organize workshops. And I just don't have, at 73, I don't have the energy to pack them anymore. I used to problem with the Constellation workshop in my mind is if I don't get 10 or 12 people, it's too hard on the 5 or 6 that I get. Because they're representing all the time and it can get very intense work and it's like they're exhausted. And it may have been a good day, but they don't come back. Linda, go ahead, please.
Does that mean when you say that 5 or 6 people, it's an all-day event or a 2-hour event?
No, I tended to do all-day events. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe that's another solution too, is not to do all-day events. Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead.
I myself did a 4-hour event once, and I was completely exhausted, and I thought, I am not doing an all-day event. So I tend to keep them to 2 hours, and I've been very successful lately, comparatively to years gone by, where I've decided the people in my city will not drive from more than a few miles, shall we say. They're very I don't know what the word is, but I started going to the burbs and finding a place and doing a workshop. And I only get 5 or 6 there, but I bought the artistic wooden dolls and I use them as representatives also. Mm-hmm. Because of course there's an inordinate amount of women compared to men in the workshops. And so I will sometimes, if I know in advance what someone wants to work in, I'll borrow my brother-in-law's shoes, or I bring my dolls and have them represent a component.
Yeah.
I also will mention to you that one of the reasons I think I got really successful lately is I've decided that I'm selling my Constellation business in a series. I just experienced this where I've told people, look, it's a minimum of 3, it's $150, and take it or leave it kind of. You can buy one at a time for $60, but if you really are serious about getting rid of this trauma, you have to come for a series.
I think that makes great sense.
Yeah, and people are like buying it, so I'm really thrilled. I just pre-plan the dates, and I leave them 2 to 3 weeks apart. And I've decided I'm driving all over town, I guess, to start doing this because I can't compile 30 people in one room.
How are you finding the places to do it?
I just phone them up. I'm actually going mostly to retirement homes because they have the space and they want new people in the space.
That's a very interesting idea.
And I get the rooms for free. So what I do is at the beginning of the workshop, when I thank Hellinger and my teachers, I also thank the people that are loaning me the room.
Cool.
Yep.
That's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, because I'm not making enough money to pay for rooms. I started out doing that.
I get it.
I've been doing this for several years, and this is the first year I actually can say I've made some money.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Hello, Izzy.
Hello, you guys must have had a time change and no one's told me.
We tried to tell you.
What?
We tried to tell you. I put it on Facebook and...
Oh, I've not been that well, so I haven't done Facebook for a week.
Okay.
So I just been checking my emails, but that's all.
Oh, it came through as an email. Oh no, it was a Facebook notification on my email. I changed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. So I just had 11:30 on. So I'm early.
You are. We acknowledge that you're early.
Sorry.
Now this business of epigenetics has gotten very, very interesting because, let's see, I think last year we had Bruce Lipton and Dawson Church, both of whom have written books about epigenetics and are both of whom are on the page that the expression that genes can be turned on and off, not just simply by long-term environmental factors or by inheritance, but you can turn them on and off with consciousness. And this is a very this is a big deal and a very heretical perspective for a lot of the standard geneticists. And so I'm going to be a little bit frivolous right now. And so one of the things that I do at these conferences is I have this partner, Bob Schwartz, who's executive director of the Constellation for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. We're both singer-songwriters. So we have this thing called the Keynoters, and we get up there and we write songs about the people or the topics and sing them before the keynote speeches. So for Dawson Church and Bruce Lipton, I wrote the Epigenetics Blues. And the epigenetics, well, it's explained. So I'm going to just, indulge us for a minute here in a moment of levity. And I am going to share the screen. I'm going to get you to see this. Okay, so you should see a PowerPoint now with Epigenetics Blues, right?
Yep.
Okay, and this is pretty much self-explanatory. Let me get rid of the formatting palette. I don't know, maybe you can't see that anyway.
Yeah, we can.
So I'm gonna start to play this song, and I'm gonna, you can look at the words as we go through this. So this was how we introduced, I think Bruce spoke the first night, and then we played this the next morning to introduce Dawson Church. And let's see, Bruce Lipton's book is The Biology of Belief, and Dawson Church's I can't think of right now. It's another very good book. All right, anyway, so here we go. So there's this village in northern Sweden that was very OCD about keeping birth and death records and had several cycles of feast and famine. Researchers analyzing these records. So this is a rough version of it that I did before the conference because unfortunately, even though this was videoed at the conference, we never got the videos, which is a pain in the ass, but we never got the videos. So you'll actually see that some of the verses got corrected in the slides from what I'm singing in this rough one. That's just a little side note. Discovered an amazing correlation. Grandsons of men who experienced these lived an astonishing 32 years less than other contemporaries. Completely unexpected result jump-started the science of epigenetics. And now, speaking from the perspective of the famous DNA molecule, Bob and I give you the epigenetics blues. Once I was the molecule that ran the whole show. Given top-down orders that made everything grow. My double helix was the king of the heap. Bossed all the cells around like so many sheep. But people kept these records in a Swedish small town. Something else was going on in this study, it was found. When feast or famine drove grandfathers to tears, lifespans of grandsons dropped by 32 years. That's how this epigenetic nonsense was born. Looking down from my throne, well, I felt nothing but scorn. But then researchers got some chickens stressed out. Babies they had were predisposed then to pout. That's true. Now, mutations used to happen only one or two ways. We changed this verse. Species changed us when I got hit by cosmic rays. Maybe when I copied me, it wasn't quite right. I didn't let that get me either down or uptight. But epigenetic switches, they're saying, some could pass down. To turn me on and off will steal my shiny crown. Acquired characteristics you can also inherit. That theory's gotta be devoid of all merit. What about Charles Darwin and then Watson and Crick? The heroes of evolution can't get hit by a brick. Next thing you know, they'll say that French guy Lamarck was thinking way back when in the right ballpark. To make matters worse, there's guys like Lipton and Church. Their far-out notions leave me still more in the lurch. To say that consciousness can mess with my genes, that means my kingdom could split right at the seams. So now I'm embattled. I don't know what to do. That's an added verse too. Do I have to live now with this nitpicking crew of methyl switches that can tell me how to rule? Who's gonna love me if I'm not the cool tool? I'm DNA, the famous double helix, you know. Who's gonna love me if I'm not the crown jewel?
That was great.
So that verse about Lamarck was a contemporary of Darwin, and he held to the idea, you know, his theory was that you could inherit things that your parents experienced. And so for the longest time, up until about 30 years ago, to call somebody Lamarckian was the worst imaginable thing you could say about somebody in genetics. And now it's turning out that he's right too. It's really turning out, in fact, there is no way. There's a book called Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, which is just a very, it's written by a science writer, not a scientist. It's a very careful book. And there, you know, the idea that somehow natural selection, you know, that there's just accidental mutations in the genes and over billions of years that slowly these different forms, you know, slowly light sensitive tissue starts to form an eyeball, and then there's another little mutation, and because it moves more towards an eyeball, that one survives and breeds and another one doesn't. That's a beautiful idea. But there are so many problems with it. And I'm not talking that we have to go back to creationism and God did it or something like that. But the fact of the matter is there almost has to be some way that the environment feeds back into the process of evolution, which is precisely what we're finding out happens in epigenetics, is that it's a two-way street. There's bacteria that You can put you can put bacteria in a medium where there's nothing to nourish them, and they will start changing their genes in order to figure out some way to eat something in that environment.
I have a question.
Yes.
Wouldn't something as simple as skin color be an environmental mutation?
Well, I mean, over millions of years, yeah, I mean, if you would think, right?
Yeah, because like different areas of the world,
Sure.
it's light reflection or heat reflection or heat retention.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think Michael's necessarily saying it's one or the other, but that it can be, you can have both going on at the same time.
It somehow has to go both ways. The other big problem is that if you look at the paleontology, you look at the fossil record, there are no intermediate forms between species. There are no fossils anywhere that are like the missing link between, you know, the little thing this looks sort of like a horse and then something later that's a horse, or the reptile and the bird. There's nothing. There's
except the Archaeopteryx.
And that's a problem. I know about that too. But it's what I'm saying is, if this happened over billions of years with slow mutations, we ought to find some of the failures. We ought to find some of the intermediate. There ought to be some skeletons of something that was kind of halfway towards this adaptation, but didn't quite make it, but it still got born, didn't get to breed because it wasn't, you know, fit enough, so to speak. And there's nothing. There's nothing. So we're heading towards an understanding that, you know, we're heading towards some kind of understanding that's profoundly different. And this gets us around to things like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic forms, that there seems to be something, you know, how do you explain that once some birds in Great Britain learn how to, you know, the birds in a certain area learn how to get food in some new way, and all of a sudden birds all over Great Britain are doing it, you know, the 100th monkey thing. How is it that when chemists first try to grow crystals of a certain kind, it's very hard to get them to form, and then 6 years later it's trivial? It's like, what's going on?
Yeah.
So there's something larger. You know, I don't know. This is heading towards a whole vast paradigm shift in science, quite honestly. And I want to do one more thing with you tonight. Aside from, well, no, let's make it two things. Now, when we had this conversation in the U.S. and Canadian Constellation conversations last year, which had a lot of big time constellators involved in them, and like 15, 18 people showing up I think they were every week. There were 11 of them. And when we talked about this issue of radical inclusiveness was brought up. And I think that's something that we have to be careful about. There's this idea in the constellation world that exclusions are bad. And there's situations in which indeed exclusions are bad. Exclusions of people, exclusions of feelings, you know, exclusions of ancestors. If some aunt was put in an asylum 50 years ago because she was slightly crazy and no one ever told the grandchildren about the fact that this aunt was even alive or what happened to her, that's a problem, okay? But radical inclusion, you know, on that social and collective family level, that's one thing. But radical inclusion on a cognitive or conceptual level, that's a whole other story. Because we had people in this conversation last year saying, well, we have to be inclusive. So therefore, therefore, anybody who does anything can do constellations. It's all constellations because we can't exclude anybody. No, I'm not joking. I mean,
Wow.
so my response to that is, okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy is a constellation. You follow me? I mean, it's like radical inclusiveness cannot, on the social level, inclusiveness is one kind of an issue, but on the conceptual level, radical inclusiveness is, it becomes meaningless. I think the other thing too is that radical inclusiveness, both on the conceptual and the social level, in the constellation community, at times, simply leads to covert exclusions. People aren't talking about it, but in fact, they don't think such and such really ought to be there. My goal with those conversations last year, which I don't really think, it wasn't apparent to me in San Diego that those conversations did what I hoped they would. I have the feeling it might be a lot more apparent in 2017. But, sorry, I lost my thread there. We can't just, I don't think it's possible for us to be a vibrant, intelligent community of healers and not have some sort of ability to talk about what we're doing and decide what's what. All right? Because there's people who are, in many regards, like first generation US constellators and regarded as such, and they don't do constellations anymore. In a real sense, they don't do constellations anymore. Now, the perspective is still there, or sometimes it isn't. I've talked to a couple of them recently. I'm not even sure the perspective is there. So then, okay, that's fine, but what are they doing at a constellation conference? Now, how do we go about dealing with this? I wanted to talk to you, that's the last point here. Human logic is not exact logic. It's fuzzy logic. It's fuzzy. It's fuzzy in a good sense. So let me give you this example. Here you are, you've got this concept of a triangle, right? And I'm going to give you 3 different situations. So here we are. We're in a college classroom or a high school geometry classroom, and the teacher is drawing a triangle on the blackboard, okay? Now, if we look at that closely, we'll see that the line wiggles a little bit and that this vertex didn't really close. So strictly speaking, in terms of like super high threshold, it's not a triangle because the line wiggles and it doesn't even close itself up, right? But it's good enough. Now take that same figure where the vertex doesn't close and one of the line wiggles and put it in a textbook. Not good enough. We expect better of a textbook. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Now take that same statement. Someone on a Boy Scout hike says, turn left at the big triangular rock that's just past the willow tree. It's on the left side. It's really big. Okay, how good a triangle does that rock have to be? You follow me? I mean, the thing in the textbook, maybe that's like 99% triangle, right? We could look at it with a magnifying glass and oh boy, it would still be, right? And the thing on the blackboard is, call it 85% triangle. And the rock, it's like maybe 60. So what we're doing with human logic, which is much better than this on-off, black and white, Aristotelian yes-no stuff, right? Is that we have a context-sensitive threshold. We have a degree of fit that we assign to things. How triangular is it? Very, only a little, right? And then we have a context-sensitive threshold that says that's good enough for this context. All right, we're going to have to do the same thing with constellations. I started out by pointing out to you, okay, so we have the prototype constellation in the workshop, right? Then we have the private constellation where there's only 2 people and we've got object persons and we're feeling into them on the tabletop or whatever. That's diverged a little bit. Then we go to the remote constellation on the telephone where now we just have a mental image of, but we still have a setup, right? We still have 6 different people in positions around and we can still move those people around. You follow me? And then we go to what I would want to call more like an ancestral journey where you just simply, you know, the facilitator, the shaman helps you talk to your grandmother, but you don't really even have an image of your grandmother, and your grandmother isn't in space any place around you. You see what I mean? That the degree of fit, not in the perspective, but the degree of fit in the process of constellation is going down in each one of these cases. That's fine. Nothing wrong with it or right with it, right? It's just something that, you know, I think we need to cope with, because we're going to see more and more different people from more different perspectives trying to work with ancestral trauma and mixtures of personal and ancestral trauma than we ever had 10 years ago. And I frankly think we have something of great value to offer the people who deal with personal trauma. Bessel van der Kolk and Robert Scare and Peter Levine and a bunch of these people. I have like 6 or 7 of these people whose books I've read that have influenced me greatly and deeply. And those books haven't tumbled on ancestral trauma yet. And they need us because we got this whole body of experience around ancestral trauma, how it behaves, what goes on with it. I think we need to be in dialogue with them. I think it's important. They need us and we need them because they have just tremendous, like Dan Siegel's book, Mindsight, tremendous valuable stuff about how trauma works in there. I think that just changed my life when I read that book. Amazingly beautiful neurological explanations of what you know, parts of your brain shut down. Your left brain literally has not experienced what happens to you during a trauma. And because your left brain is the part that talks about it, that generalizes about it, that consciously learns from it, and that decides that it's over, your right brain doesn't know that it's over. Think about that. And your left brain has never seen it because your hippocampus is shut down. And so what happened during that time is recorded over here and it's bouncing around in here and it gets triggered when something similar happens. But your left brain is looking at it and trying to make sense of it as if it were present tense, because it never figured out that it was over. These are amazing insights. What'd you say?
That's your fabulous office floor analogy that works so well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
The corporate brain. All right, folks.
Yeah, sorry, I did miss some of what you were saying because I went up to the bathroom and made tea. But I'm only just finding now that I'm able to face certain things. For a long time, I felt that I've been affected by what's happened in the past with the Magdalene sisters. I don't know who. I don't know. You know, the Magdalene sisters, they were nuns who ran places where unmarried mothers and other young girls were sent.
So you mean these are nuns?
Yes, nuns, yeah. In Ireland, in the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of dreadful things happened to these young girls. And it's only now that I'm beginning to be able to face it. Today, I actually watched a video where women were being interviewed who'd been kept in those places. And it was absolutely horrific. And I couldn't watch it. Up until very recently, I couldn't even watch a film because it affected me so much. And I didn't know why. But it's only now that I'm beginning to be able to face it. It's almost as if I'm ready for the healing, whatever it is.
What was the last thing you said? It's almost as if what?
As if I'm ready now for the healing of whatever's happened in the past, and also the hunger, the hunger in Ireland when lots of people starved to death. I've actually started getting books from Amazon, and I've read a section on what happened in Bantry, where my mother's family came from, and it was absolutely horrific, absolutely horrific. But I've always known that whenever it was mentioned, these things were mentioned, I got this dreadful feeling. And I always knew that I'd been affected somehow. It's something that's come down through the family. But now I'm nearly 61, and now is when I'm starting to face it and look at these videos and be able to actually look at written work. So, and I've never mentioned anything about it in any constellation that I attended as well. I just couldn't face it.
I think thank you for sharing that, and I think you're making total sense. I mean, we are not ready to face certain things. You know, we get flooded too quickly, and so we go right back into fight or flight or freeze or whatever. The hippocampus shuts down again, and we keep that walled off. We have to. You have to until you're ready to deal with it.
Yeah.
And it needs to be, as Peter Levine says so eloquently, it has to be, you know, he calls it titration. You need to do it a little bit at a time. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I think, it would have been too much for me. It would have been, as you say, I just wouldn't have been able to do it. I just couldn't face it. But now I'm starting to feel quite different about it. So I don't know how that's come about. It's really strange.
I can give you a theory.
Yeah.
I see people as, like, you know, think of a pearl or an onion. You know, there's layers of experience being created, getting bigger, and you're right.
Yeah.
And I think that in some cases we have to heal the outer layers. You know, we heal them first, and then they get strong enough and steady enough that they can be a safe container to contain the overwhelm that's on. You know, you do work on layers 9 through 12, and you take a little rest, and you get those guys working. They're part of your life, and there's, you know, that whatever happened there is cool now, right? It happened. You might be sad about it, but you're not. It isn't trauma. It isn't after trauma anymore. And that's necessary before you could go back to layer 4, where something similar happened, but it was like the first time it happened when you were just a kid or something, and is more intense than the one on layer 9 through 12. But if you didn't do 9 through 12 first, you wouldn't have a safe container, and you would get flooded. Yeah. And when people get badly flooded, either they're emotionally incapable, or it goes to their body and they have some somatic reaction, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Marie. Okay. Sharon, how are you doing?
I am doing well.
Are we still making sense?
Yes.
What thoughts do you have? You're our outside observer here. You're very important.
Oh my God, I have so many questions, but you could be here till the next 2 weeks.
We got 5 minutes, please. Fire away.
5 minutes. My first question.
It's good for all of us to hear the questions, really.
My first question is, can the family constellations be done remotely, as in for someone far away, or do they have to be in person? Or can you even do them for somebody that that doesn't know about it?
Well, I mean, I'll quickly answer that one. I mean, remote constellations happen all the time. Most of my work is remote.
Okay.
I do far more remote work than I do local work. And as far as working for somebody else, if you work on the whole family system, sometimes it has a good impact on people who weren't there that, you know, but if you come around, if somebody comes around and say, I want to work because my kid is an alcoholic, so I want to do some work to help my kid, then I have to ask some questions, right? Are you trying to fix your kid? Are you, you know, we don't necessarily have permission to interfere with this child's fate. This child needs to go through certain things and grow in certain ways. And we, you know, on the other hand, if you are trying to work on yourself in such a way that it is helpful to your child, that's a different story. You understand? People come around a lot of the time who they start out wanting to help some other member of the family, and they end up doing work around themselves first, and it does help another person.
I really like what you said about asking permission, because personally I feel that it is rude to heal somebody without their permission, because like in my mother's case, that is her entire identity. She has to be ready for that before I can do anything with her.
My native teachers told me you absolutely have no right to take somebody's pain away before they want to let go of it. They need it.
Yep, she needs it. She does. It defines her. I'd love to change that someday, but I wouldn't. I don't think I'd be able to change it personally in my head. You know, not change it for her, but take the step to change it without her permission.
If you are carrying a big chunk of her fate, if you are carrying a bunch of her pain, and you do work on yourself that involves giving that back to her, that can have a very positive effect. Now, people come along, let me say this to you. I think a lot of people here know this, but let me say it, it's really important. People come along and they say, what? I don't want to give my pain back to I can't hurt my mother that way. I got to carry this for her. I don't see it that way. If your mom goes through life and the time after death, she's still entangled, and does not experience the consequences of her own fate, and as far as I'm concerned, she's going to have to live another life and go through the same shit again.
Aww.
So it's always better for you, and furthermore, you're living a life that's burdened by, hi Kat, you're living a life that's burdened by her fate. So the two of you are entangled in such a way that neither one of you is able to make the best use of your life in terms of the evolution of your soul. So I always try to help people understand that, no, it's a good thing to give dad's pain back to dad if it's really dad's fate. If dad was the one who was in World War II, I don't want to be walking around any longer holding it for him. Now, maybe it was useful that I held it for him while we were all growing up. It helped the family stay together. He was crazy, right? Now he's, in whatever state he's in. I don't think that souls that are entangled with their families, I don't think they just go into the light and it's all over. Right on to their next life. I think that there's some kind of a poorly defined period, because time isn't real in this other world in a sense. But I'll come to you in a second, Linda. There's it can be very good for me and very good for my dad if I give him his fate back, and I don't walk around with the pain in his feet or with the fear, the survivor guilt. My dad had terrible survivor guilt. He was in Okinawa. It was a screaming disaster. Okay.
I know Linda wants to say something, but I have another. Now, me holding her pain or carrying her pain for her, could that be somewhat detrimental to her in a way, as that she can't, that gives her the permission not to face it?
Yes.
She can't resolve it if it's not within her. So
Yeah.
by you giving it back, she has the chance to resolve it. That's what I was going to say.
Oh, that makes beautiful sense. Thank you.
Yeah, because she's disassociated from it. And if you're feeling the need to give it back, then she's also ready to receive.
Okay. Okay. That just really makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. That's not to say it's always easy to feel this. I mean, I have one client right now who I think is very, very, you know, it gets more complicated and it's harder when the parent is still alive. When the person is still alive, because there's a real fear that if I clear myself, what's going to happen to her? She's 70 years old, and is she suddenly going to have something terrible happen to her? That's a much harder case than when they're already in the grave.
However, when we actually see constellations where this is happening in the traditional type, the parent always wants it back. Always.
Good, thank you. Anybody else here?
And also that often within that there's a grandparent or that can also help the mother, or it may need to be handed back further, or like the constellations enable you to see how not alone you are in it. You know, you're supported by the whole lineage, and that makes the entire taking your fate back or owning your own fate so much easier and so much more gracious.
Yes. So what's the cat's name? Unmute yourself.
This is Helly. This is my grandson's cat. He named her Helicopter, but I think of Helly because she came to me one Christmas as the Helleborus, the Christmas rose, and so I quite like her being Helly, which is, of course, his son. Suits me.
Well, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Helly, for coming to our little meeting here.
She looks like my Drusilla.
All right, so folks, next week I'm going to talk to you about how to work with everyday symbols.
2 weeks from now.
Sorry?
2 weeks from now?
Yes, 2 weeks from tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about how to read everyday symbols. I'll be talking to you a bit about what I call home altar constellations, because that's one of the ways that I do this constantly. But I'm not like psychic in a certain sense. I'm not clairvoyant. I am extremely sensitive to events in everyday life that carry symbolic meaning. And everybody is able to do a lot more of this than they do, whether it's facilitating constellations or simply walking through the events of your life. So next week is interpreting symbols, seeing reality. Not 2 weeks from tonight is that. Please, if this was a wonderful conversation tonight, I thought. Thank you all for being here. Please spread the news around. Sandy and I are trying to get a mobile-friendly website built and change to a mobile-friendly newsletter format, and that is proving slow and difficult. So we are not in a position to publicize this very much right now because we're doing all this constant computer stuff.
I'm really surprised that Stephen and Catherine weren't here tonight. I thought I'd spoken to both of them and thought they were coming. Anyway.
Well, anyway, please do, bring some friends back if this was good, and bring people who don't necessarily know about this. You see that it's very good to have people who are kind of new to this. They ask wonderful questions. It gives people, aside from me, a chance to explain things. It helps all of us. So thank you all very much for being here. I enjoyed it very much. Many blessings. And thank you also, Helly, for being here.
Oh,
You're
I
sitting
always
there with this,
appreciate the kitty
this
pictures.
noble profile.
She's so still, you have to wonder if she's real.
Yeah. All right, folks. Izzy,
Thank you, everyone.
stay on afterwards, will you?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. You can stop the recording, Sandy.